My name's Graham Goodwin, and today I'm talking to Lennart Ljung, who's Professor in Linköping in Sweden. So, good morning, Lennart.
Good morning, Graham. It's very nice to be in your office here and sit and have a nice chat with you.
Indeed, I'm looking forward to learning more about you. So I'm going to just ask you a number of questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you say about yourself and your views on the progress of our discipline. So maybe we just start with some background. Lennart, where were you brought up and where did you begin your university studies?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Malmö, which is the third largest city in Sweden. It's very close to one of the classical university cities in Sweden, Lund University, which is just 50 minutes away. So it was very natural for me to go to Lund for my university studies. So that's why I started my studies.
Okay, and why did you choose to do engineering?
Well, actually, I did not choose to do engineering. I couldn't decide. I wasn't sure whether I should be a mathematician, study mathematics at university, or I should be an engineer. So I did both at the same to begin with. So I entered the school of engineering in Lund. At the same time, I studied mathematics on the university level and followed that for some time through 3 semesters, and that is above the level you get to at the university studies. At the end of the third semester, at the final exam, I did not pass. I did not solve the last problem. I passed very well, but did not solve the last problem, and that was a sign to me I'm not going to be a mathematician. Mathematics is very one-dimensional, and if you do have some contribution to that, you have to be at the very top. So I decided to, well, I will be an engineer instead. That's more broad and more safe.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. So the experiences you obtained as an undergraduate in Sweden, do you think they differ from the experiences of the students today?
Yeah, I think we were more, we were less demanding. We had no textbook in many subjects. The topics were defined by the lectures, and we had not very many electives, not many choices. I choose programming as my only elective topic. And imagine, in the end of the 1960s, you could be an engineer without taking one single course in programming. But I did one. Oh,
that's amazing.
Fortran.
Fortran, yes, indeed. Okay, so when you finished your undergraduate program, you went straight on to do a PhD, is that correct?
Yes, I stayed on at Lund and joined the control department under Carl Astrom's leadership.
All right, and do you want to say some things about your supervisor?
Yeah, already in 1970, as this was, Carl Astrom was a legend at our university. So this group was very well organized, almost like a company. The graduate students had specific tasks. We had a well-kept Fortran program database that was and helped us as in our PhD studies. A very energetic, a very creative environment. So I had very fun there. I learned a lot of things. Carl used to stick me some papers to read. Read that's good for you. And he gave me the advice to study seriously the book by Lennart Ljung, Advanced Probability. That was an excellent advice. It turned out later on. So that's how I was brought up into science. At the same time, I could say that if I count the number of hours that I sat down with Carl Astrom in a formal supervision situation, they were not many over 4 years, but his influence came the other way through simple things to read, suggestions and all that.
That's interesting. And what on earth persuaded you to work in the control area in the first place?
Well, when I could not be a mathematician, I decided to be a physicist. So I did my master's thesis in physics, solid state physics, on alloys spectra, and it didn't catch on. I didn't really like physics so much after that. So, and this was 1970, and you know that there was a lot of talk about cybernetics at that time, and also, although we did not at all understand the full impact of computers, we felt that somehow programming will probably be important in the future some way. So, in that sense, automatic control was a little bit more futuristic than physics, so that's why I went into automatic control.
No, that's an interesting transition. And so you started doing control. What things excited you as you did your PhD? What were the things that really interested you as you did it?
Well, I think it is what I think still attracts the graduate students, this mixture of nice mathematics, interesting mathematics, and some practical applicability around the corner. So that was exciting stuff.
Yeah.
And Carl handed me a couple of books and papers by Jakob Zipkin, who was very well known at that time for his work on learning systems, as it was called. That actually was another name for stochastic approximation, it turned out. Very exciting things. You could learn things by just observing how they behaved. And as a result of that, I went on a pre-doc to Moscow to spend half a year with Zipkin in his famous lab in the control systems, the Institute of Control Sciences. And that was a very exciting time, 6 months. Maybe mostly from a cultural point of view. 1972 was at the height of a Brezhnev stagnation in Russia or Soviet Union, and that was an interesting time to spend there. And of course, scientifically, I met all the great, well-known leaders, even at the institute, and not the least Zipkin himself was an excellent person to work with.
Were there differences between the ways that the Russians or the Soviet bloc researchers were undertaking research and what you were familiar with in Sweden?
Yeah, you see, the Institute of Control Sciences was a huge institute with 2,000 people employed there. Mostly for lifetime. They got their degree from the Moscow Institute. You had to live in Moscow. You had to be born in Moscow to live in Moscow. So you came from Moscow Institutes, and they spent their whole life in these institutes. So many were very good. Many were not so good, but they still had a lifetime position there. So it was not the same kind of creativity and energetic feeling as I had in Lund as a PhD student. So very different in that sense.
That's interesting. So then you completed your PhD back in Lund.
Yes, 1974.
In 1974, okay. And then where did you go immediately after you completed the PhD?
More or less directly after I completed my PhD, I went as a postdoc to Stanford to spend some time, a year with Tom Kailat in ISL at Stanford. And that was also a very energetic and good environment to work with. Tom Kailat had a large staff of PhD students working for him, and many great people I met at that time. Very exciting. Of course, Stanford is a fantastic place for a Swede anyway, with the climate and the closeness to beaches and mountains and what have you.
Yeah, so somehow intersected scientific excitement with worldly excitement.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the years I talk about from 1970 to 1975 were very formative for me. First of all, our two sons were born both in that period. I met Carl Astrom, I met Jakob Zipkin, I met Tom Kailat in the span of these 5 years. So 3 excellent mentors, but that meant a lot for me, my scientific development, clearly. All of them know mathematics very well. They know that mathematics is an important tool to work with in control, but they also know that control is not about mathematics primarily. So I got this feeling of what is important and what is good in control from 3 different people, had basically the same kind of view.
It's interesting how that then probably shaped the rest of your life in terms of the way you did things. So you completed this period at Stanford.
Yes.
And then what happened then? Did you take a permanent job somewhere? What was next?
Well, I have to tell you about the situation in Sweden in 1974-75. At that time, a professor was a head of department. There was only one professor per subject per university in Sweden. So in 1974, there were 4 professors in control in Sweden, in Stockholm, Gothenburg, Lund and Linköping. It so happened that the professor in Linköping, Jorma Hissanen, who was also my opponent, by the way, he decided to resign and move back to his position at IBM in San Jose. So somehow, suddenly there was a position available. Otherwise, I have to wait for somebody to die or retire to have an opportunity to get that. So I applied for this position in 1975, early 75. And in these Asian times, when you had a committee to sort out who would be employed, we did not just look up you in scholar citation. No,
the Scopius or
I
Google Scholar.
Google citation.
Yes.
Google citations. They actually read everything I'd written.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, amazing.
Yes.
So I was very lucky because of that. I got that position in Linköping. So at 1976, when I was 29 years old, I made my first and final career step at the same time.
That's amazing.
And I remain there ever since as a professor in Linköping.
Right, but doing different roles, I guess, running different organisations.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, I've always been the head of the division, control division in Linköping, and that involved a lot of work to begin with to build up the undergraduate program and the graduate program. And after a while, we can talk about that also a little bit later, perhaps. I created some other broader organizations cooperating with other groups at the university. But for the first 15 years, I basically was just a professor in a group that grew from one person to 25 until 1990, and now we're about 50 in the group. So,
so that's an amazing development from those beginnings. They obviously chose well. So you've worked in Linköping for a very long time. Have you visited other places for sabbaticals or longer periods of leave that you'd like to talk about?
Sure. I mean, as I say, I liked Stanford very much. So I returned to Stanford for a sabbatical in 80-81, and then I went to MIT 85-86 on another sabbatical. And then, as you know, I like Newcastle, Australia very much. I think this is my fifth kind of mini sabbatical here this time.
That's also amazing.
Yeah,
good for us.
Yeah, I like it very much. Yeah. So I've been to many places as on different parts of my career, but I don't have had only one real job all the time as a professor in Linköping.
Okay. So during these leaves and with many other opportunities you had, what about special collaborators, people that have influenced your work and that you've enjoyed working with?
Yeah, of course, I had a large number of students, and I also worked a lot with my graduate students. But if I looked into my publication lists, I may have more than 100 different co-authors. But I tend to not directly always co-publish with my students. Only when I've done, say, above and beyond the normal supervision duty, I choose to be co-author of the work that is published. But I have other co-workers. I can point to Torsten Söderström, for example, who was a colleague of mine when I was a graduate student in Lund. Yeah. So we together did a lot of work in the early 70s on closed loop identification and on recursive identification. And that culminated in 1983, where we published our book on recursive identification, I and Torsten. And since when I'm a good friend with Torsten, we keep in contact. I ask him whenever I have problems with technical problems, I ask him for advice. But we haven't written anything since 1983.
Yeah, it's interesting that you put all of that intense work together into a book and you still talk to each other.
Yes.
Indeed. So it must be a very special relationship. Do you see research as a short-term or a long-term adventure? Where do you place it on the spectrum?
Well, things take time, generally speaking, and I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm very worried, actually, right now, with the current frenzy of bibliometrics, where you give the impression that science and research is about writing a paper, counting how many times it's cited in a short time span, and that is what research is about. It's not. Research is about inventing and discovering new theories, new methodologies, and having other people use and reuse that hopefully for a very long time. Yes. That is what research is about. Things take time.
Yes. So do you see like that you return to things later maybe and re-evaluate them. So this process of research can take many years where a topic is revisited and refined until finally you say...
Exactly.
Yeah.
You say, I mean, I don't play tennis, but I took tennis lessons at Stanford a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I learned that follow through is a very important concept in tennis. That means basically that you should fulfill the racket swing even after the ball has been hit and thrown away. So that is follow through. I think that applies to many things in addition to tennis, especially to research. So think of follow through. That is what I've been telling myself.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so before you mentioned that a thing that was exciting about control was this combination of theory and relevance. Can I just spend a couple of minutes talking about the application side of it?
Sure.
Are there things that applications or approaches to real problems that you'd like to talk about to give us some context for the applied side?
I can say during my first 15 years in Linköping, I was basically just involved in, say, toy applications, like master thesis project of simple character, often applying identification techniques to some processes in industry in a relatively straightforward manner, all useful but straightforward. In the beginning of the 90s, I thought that we should do a little bit more than that. You remember that 90s was also a time all over the world where you created big centra, broad centra with other groups. So I had the idea that I think that control people should team up more with computer scientists, and because we have something in common, not really the basic views of many things. And we know that in many universities around the world there is a tension between EE and computer science.
Yes.
So I wanted to bridge that in a sense. So based on that, I put together a center in 1995 that comprised groups from EE, mostly signals and systems, and groups from computer science, and a dozen big companies or semi-big companies in Sweden. And we started on a bigger project, bigger center. And there has been a number of centers after that, starting in 1995, still continuing. Two of them are still running right now with 5 years left time, funding time. So that has been very, very useful. Or in that context, I became much more involved in more serious applications.
Are there anything you'd like to tell us about how you approach these large-scale, serious applications? Is there something that other people could benefit from in the way you do this? I mean, from managerial or the way the problem is approached.
Yeah, I think it is a matter of having an open mind to other groups. Not impose your views of what is science to them, because we have another view. I mean, model means one thing for us. It means a totally different thing for a computer scientist.
Yes.
Really be humble and accept that, and let things take time also here. And do some things together. The good thing is really to solve a pretty practical problem, each throwing their own tools in that, and you see that show to each other that it works together. But I think that's the key to make it work.
It's interesting. Yeah. Yes, so Lennart, you just mentioned a large number of companies that you work with. Would you like to give us an example of one of those interactions and what it led to?
Yeah, one good example is when we started this first center ISIS 1995. We Saab aircraft company as one of our partners, and they wanted to have help with our navigation systems. They of course used inertial navigation and GPS systems. Yes. They want to have another leg to stand on.
Yes.
And then they knew that they were measuring the altitude by the altitude meter from the airplane to the ground. Yes. At the same time they had maps of the ground available. Height maps.
Yes.
So by matching the altitude to the ground map, you could decide a little bit where are you. So as a complement, you drive around over an area and see how does the height profile change, and compare with what is possible to experience on your map.
Yes.
Globally. That was terrain navigation through navigation through terrain measurements.
Yes.
And we solved it by attacking it by a simplistic probabilistic approach.
Right.
So we were gridding up the ground in the grids and computing the posterior probability on each point that we were there.
Right.
And of course, as you made the grid fine, and as you made it adaptive, we came very close to what became particle filtering.
So
the particle filtering was not really invented. We did not invent it, but we were at the very front of it when it came. So we had a head start. In particular, my colleague Fredrik Gustafsson had a head start on particle filtering. He wrote some important contributions both on the theory and the application to navigation for using particle filters early on.
Yes.
And then that transpired to more serious things on sensor fusion,
yes,
SLAM,
yes,
and more or less autonomy. How can you autonomously decide where you are? That has become a big area for our control group, mostly now led by Fredrik Gustafsson, that venture. So that was a spin-off from a real application into something that was scientifically valid and compare very well to what's happening in science at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a great story. So that the origins in a real-world problem where there was a question to be solved, and then how that thought process led to ultimately to tools that have general applicability and today are very widely used.
I think it's a very nice example of that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Now, in terms of practical things, your work has had huge influence beyond your immediate vicinity through your MATLAB toolbox. And do you want to talk about that for a minute, how that happened and how you view that piece of work?
It's a good example of how timing and luck plays a big role in your life.
Yes.
And that was when I was in sabbatical at MIT, 85, 86, that I bought MATLAB to MIT in the fall of 85. Actually, I bought MATLAB at least to Leeds at MIT. So, and then I used MATLAB when I taught my graduate course on identification in the spring of 86, by showing some code snippets in MATLAB how these ideas could be used in practice to my course participants. And then Jack Little, who's the owner of MathWorks, called me up and he had heard about that. I said, why don't you write a toolbox on identification for MATLAB? Yeah. And I said, no, I can't do that. I'm not a sufficiently good programmer. But somehow I was persuaded and started to write this thing. After a month, I had version 1.0 finished. But later on, a lot more work was put into that. For the first 20 years, I wrote every code line myself in the product that was sold. Nowadays, for the last 10 years, it's more of a teamwork where MathWorks has more direct influence on the final product design of the code. But I'm heavily involved, like almost every day, in issues of its toolbox.
Amazing.
But I never really considered it to be part of my scientific work.
Right.
It's part of follow through, actually.
Ah, right. So, in what sense does it follow through? What can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, if you write a paper, maybe somebody will read it. You never know.
Right.
If you write a textbook, well, if it's adopted, you find you educate some students in your views.
Yes.
But if you write the code,
yes, people
use your ideas without knowing it. So the final, I think, for this type of work, it's the final way to make the theories used in practice.
Right.
And this toolbox has a lot of industrial users.
Indeed. Absolutely true. Yes. And do industrial users give you feedback and say, how it went and what things they liked and so on? Is that part of the joy of having this?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I frequently get sometimes too many mails from people who have questions about this and that,
right,
relating to the toolbox syntax partly, but mostly to the the word identification problems. What can you do? Use it. How should you approach? What ideas should you use? So that has been very good to have this kind of direct contact with a lot of people you never would have met otherwise.
Right. Yes. No, that's interesting. Okay, so let's move away from these practical things and move back to people. Are there people you'd like to talk about just briefly who you think have had the most influence on the way you think about problems in your career?
Yeah, there's no doubt. I talked about my three mentors from the early 1970s. There's no doubt that Carl Astrom is the person that had most influence on my scientific career.
Right.
He has always been a role model for me in basically how you run a department, how you approach research, how you relate it to applications, and how you disseminate what you have done.
Yes.
So that's clear. He has had to make greatest influence for sure.
Yes, that's interesting. There's the person with the greatest influence. What about some highlights of your career? Are there things that really stand out, exciting moments that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, if I look back to what I've done, I can point to three things that I'm kind of proud of.
Okay, great.
One is creating this group in Linköping with now 50 people.
Yeah.
We have graduated 75 PhD students over years. And as you know, your own PhD students are like your children. You follow them all the way through life, and you have joy when it's good for them, and you really follow them. And that's I think is one of the most good feelings you can have about your what you have done for research.
Yes. Yes.
The second thing I could point to is my book, System Identification Theory for a User,
Yes. which
somehow, to my surprise and delight, has been read by many more people than I thought to begin with. And the third item I could point to is, of course, the System Identification Toolbox, which is the way we have brought forward identification to many users around the world in different areas, both in industry and in academia.
Yeah, I think everybody would agree. These are really great achievements, and must be exciting for you. What about challenges, Lennart? Were there any challenges that you're prepared to tell us about?
Well, I think the biggest challenge I've had was when I started these bigger centers in the middle of the 90s,
yeah.
to really make the computer scientists and AI people bring me into the control picture. And that required a lot of work, and I wouldn't say I succeeded so well. I mean, there's still much things more to be done. We have not really penetrated what can be done without your tools scientifically. But we have created, at least right now, several groups within our department in cross couplings with other departments. We're actively using a broad view on automation, autonomy and control based on the experience we have had in this kind of development in the different centra. So that is a challenge that only partly succeeded, but I think it will turn out that in the long run it means something, will mean something.
Indeed. All right, what about anecdotes of things you'd like to say that may be humorous or interesting, that you feel would be interesting?
Yeah, I can tell a story about mathematics, which you're partly involved in yourself.
Okay.
When I was a graduate student, I studied convergence of the least squares method. And I was pretty convinced that it will always converge if the smallest eigenvalue of a regression matrix tends to infinity.
Right.
And I had many proofs of that, but I found errors in all of them. So it delayed my thesis certainly a half year at the least, because I wanted to have that theorem in my thesis. Because as you realize, that we also have solved the convergence problem for the self-tuned regulator,
Yes.
because that is essentially least squares problem.
Yes.
And finally I gave up in my thesis and just published a minor result where we confined your model set to be only a finite number of models.
Right.
And I was still convinced afterwards that theorem must be able to prove it. And many people, other people tried. I was reviewing 10 different papers. And I was an expert at finding the errors in the proofs because I had done so many myself.
Right.
But you remember when I came to Newcastle in 1978, I talked about this problem in one of my seminars.
Indeed.
And maybe it was caught on your attention because you proved something a few years later when you were on sabbatical at Harvard.
Yes.
For a convergence of adaptive regulators,
yes.
where you realize that somehow you must link the rate of increase of the different eigenvalues to be able to prove the convergence.
Yes.
And a few years even later, C.S. Lai showed that my conjecture was wrong.
Right.
You can give examples where the smallest eigenvalue tends to infinity, but you still don't have convergence and consistency. What is required is a link between how fast does the fastest eigenvalue relate to the slowest eigenvalue. I think it's a log thing that should be related between.
Right.
So my conjecture was wrong. The point of my story is that shows the strength of mathematics. If you can't prove something, if you're convinced it's right, maybe it's not right.
Yes. I think it also shows this point about research being a long-term adventure,
Yeah.
because that went through many cycles before the question was ultimately resolved. So,
Exactly.
Yeah, it's an example of that. Okay, so you and I both still work in the control area. Do you have any comments about the current status of control and what's exciting and what's important?
Well, it's clear to many of us that we are now in the transition from automation to autonomy. And that requires also a broad view of what tools you need to go from automation to autonomy. And I would advocate that we more clearly embrace what AI, artificial intelligence, has to offer in that respect. And I'm, as I said, still involved in centra that have autonomous vehicles, for example, as a big research area. And I'm excited about what can be done in that. And I will be very pleased to see how much the insights for automatic control will deliver for final solutions here. Yeah. So that is one thing that I like to follow. Another thing
yes.
is that in my book on identification, I kind of view and described a coherent structure view of system identification, which was quite scattered in the beginning of the 70s.
Yes.
Nowadays we have seen an onslaught of new techniques, mostly from statistical learning theory, from sparsity, from convexity, say nuclear norms and what have you, atomic norms and so on, yes. Which right now looks more like a new big bag of tricks for the area, and we don't really know when to use what and what are the properties. I would like to see what will happen when all these pieces fall together eventually on a big puzzle, and see what is a picture of parameter estimation and system identification in that view with the new tools. What do they mean in the final analysis?
Yes, I think this is a wonderful point, and I remember very well how exciting it was to read your composite understanding of system identification, because it really was a smorgasbord. But if one read your paper, it all became somehow clear that all these pieces fitted together, and there was one way to think about it, and all these things were somehow offshoots of a central thought. So I think I resonate with your idea that doing that in some of the emerging fields now would be exciting as well.
Yeah. I hope I will live long enough to see what happens with that.
Oh, sure you will. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our discussion, Lennart, if that's all right. I wondered if we could perhaps end with thinking about the next generation and the young people. Is there any advice that you'd like to give them, or words of wisdom in conclusion?
Yeah, I would like to say that we should remember that we still have an exciting future in control. I think that future is linked to a broader view of what our subjects, what our disciplines can bring into our field. And as I said before, autonomy is certainly a thing that will be around the corner. Very exciting to work on in coming years for the youth generation. But also remember that things take time and follow through.
Yeah, things take time and follow through. Lennart, it was great to talk to you today. I learned a lot about you, even though I've known you for many years.
For many, 30 something years. We met first time in 1974. No, 1976, on your way to Tbilisi.
Indeed,
yeah.
Indeed, that's right. So it's been a long journey for both of us, but talking to you today has been great. Thank you for your time and effort in talking to me and sharing it with other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Very nice. Thank you.